Buenas tardes todos. Para interpretación en español, por favor hagan clic en el botón Interpretación en la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom. Después, para activar el audio en español, haga clic en Silenciar audio original y haga clic en Español. Gracias a nuestra traductora hoy día, Jaylene Toranzo, por acompañarnos hoy. Good afternoon, everyone, to the Climate Resilience for Communities of Color webinar. For those wanting access to Spanish interpretation, please go ahead and click on Interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Click on Mute Original Audio, and then click Spanish. Gratitude to Jaylene Toronzo for Spanish interpretation today. And for those community members wanting access to ASL interpretation, our interpreter, Elizabeth Shepler, will be spotlighted by our team. Gratitude to Elizabeth Shepler for ASL interpretation today. Welcome, everyone. As folks are trickling in, let's go ahead and begin with a land acknowledgement today. Let's remember that we stand on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, the Klamath, Tumwater, Clackamas, Cowlitz Band of the Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and over 380 tribes who have made their home along the Columbia River. We acknowledge the ancestors of the original people of these lands. And in remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. May we pay attention, support, collaborate with our Indigenous community as we collectively work towards climate resilience in our state. My name is Christy Munoz. I work with United Way of the Columbia-Willamette under the Climate Resilience Department. My preferred pronouns are she, ella. So our United Way's mission is to improve lives, strengthen communities, and advance equity by mobilizing the caring power of people across our region. We recognize that structural racism and other forms of oppression have contributed to persistent disparities in our region. Our efforts and programs in early learning, disaster resilience, and housing elevate the voices of marginalized groups that have been made vulnerable. We know that centering race and ethnicity is critical to ending historical and social inequities that continue to exist in our region. Do know that we are recording today's webinar, and a link will be sent to those who registered later this week. The recordings will be made available per request in English, Spanish, and ASL interpretation to share and then look at post-webinar. As an attendee, you can place all of your questions under the Q&A that can be found by clicking at the very bottom. Do know that the chat has been disabled. We hope to leave a few minutes for questions. However, we are prioritizing allotting this time to our researchers today. So if your questions go unanswered, we will be sharing contact information for all presenters, interpreters, and our team contacts after the webinar. Thank you for understanding. So today we're all here to center some research leads who have, as of this year, recently published some reports. Hopefully these reports you'll find are intended to amplify disaster resilience for Oregon's frontline communities of color. We are aware that often assessments, reports, toolkits are often gatekept at conferences or require funding for people to access. These 5 timely reports and toolkits are going to bring up some gaps, insights, and recommendations that we hope will inspire collective development of programming, services, and outreach in the disaster and climate resilience movement for our state. So to kick us off, our first speaker, Nutu Haynes, she, her, is a senior fellow at the Center for Public Service with Portland State University. Nu is a public health consultant, instructor, an entrepreneur, and I'm lucky to also call them a friend. Specializing in intergovernmental relations, building collaborations, and strategic partnership with both public and private sectors are only some of Nu's strong suits. Nu led a research team this year that focused on disaster communications around wildfire and earthquakes. The population surveyed included African American, Black immigrants, and refugee communities. Their research title is Disaster Communication with African American, Black immigrant, and refugee communities. Thank you, Nu, for joining us. You can go ahead and kick it off.
Great. Thank you so much, Christy. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you this afternoon. I want to thank Christy and the United Way team for really assembling a pretty stellar crew this afternoon. So I'm going to be kicking it off this afternoon. And so welcome, everyone. I'm glad you're all here with us. So I'm going to do some kind of high-level explanation and sharing about our assessment and our project. At the end of 2021, the Oregon Health Authority reached out to the Center for Public Services housed at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon. And here they came to the center and really reached out with the idea of having an assessment around communications. The project team really took a very extensive approach on really narrowing down the population group that we wanted to look at. And so the purposes of this particular assessment that was brought to us was twofold. First, really to identify how diverse community groups prefer to receive information, and to identify how they prefer to be engaged in preparing for Cascadia subduction zone earthquakes and major wildfires. And so the intent of the assessment was really to offer insight on risk communication, how we're offering that to our communities, how we're utilizing preparedness experts to really understand the BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, people of color communities around natural disaster. And as I mentioned, we were really trying to kind of hone in on what BIPOC really meant for this particular project. And so as we did that, we really wanted to we reached out to several different researchers within the area and said, you know, what type of work are you doing that's similar to this, and which population groups are you working with? And it came down to the fact that some folks were really working within the Latinx population, and we knew that we had such limited time and resources. We wanted to kind of hone in a little further. And so we really landed on our African American, Black, immigrant, and refugee population residing in the Portland metropolitan area. So how did we do some of that recruitment? Well, part of the referral process really came about through the Oregon Health Authority's community engagement team. This really stellar team that was put into play from Oregon Health Authority in, I believe it was like summer of 2020. This team really brought together and said, here are some of the community-based organizations that we're working with. Why don't we start here? And so we took that particular list that they were working with and narrowed it down. So we do want to acknowledge and thank Maria Waters and Cynthia Vimerio, who helped us with that short list of potential community-based organizations to work with. So as I mentioned, you know, due to some time, you know, contracting and time constraints, our project team narrowed down our focus to the African American, Black immigrant, and refugee population. And we looked at 7 different community-based organizations and churches that were identified. Of those 7, 57 participated in our focus groups. Our focus groups lasted about 90 minutes per focus group. 2 of those 7 sessions were held face-to-face. I do want to mention that piece with the community engagement team, giving us that warm handoff to connecting to community partners was really effective. That was probably the best way to kind of get into the community, as researchers. And so I do want to acknowledge that as an important piece. So here we have the list of the community-based organizations that were a part of this assessment. We had folks from the Muslim Education Trust, African Youth and Community Organization. That was one of our larger groups. We had St. John's All Nations Church of God in Christ, and they are out in North Portland. Urban League of Portland. We had the Togo Community Organization of Oregon, Somali American Council of Oregon, and then the Rohingya Youth Association of Portland. We were really hoping to get more focus groups signed up, but our timing was slightly off. We did this in spring-ish, there was Ramadan for our Muslim community and then Easter for the Christian community. So some of these folks were very busy with a lot of different religious celebrations. And so it was something to consider for future work that we would do. So I'm going to share a bit about how we broke down the data and the themes that were a part of this assessment. So the 5 categories we used to organize our information centered around barriers to communication, remedies for that communication, factors of perception, what did people think about the issues at hand, barriers to action, what kept them from taking action, and then remedies to action. And some of the narrative themes that really came about from what we took from our focus groups were, one, language is very important. Now, that goes without saying that that's important to many of our communities. So again, they reiterated the fact that make sure things are in the language that we need them in. Multiple ways of learning is preferred. So again, not only coming into communities and sharing our conversations, but perhaps thinking about other modalities in training and information sharing, whether it be video content, written material. Something that came out of our conversations was people did not like to be referred to as difficult to reach community, right? We hear that term often used in communication. And so they're saying, stop, don't use that term with us because we're not difficult to reach. We know where we are. And so I think that piece was really kind of a good thing that we walked away with. Another is similar common places to get information. Where can we get this information that we already go to, right? So is it our church, our synagogue, our temple? Is it our community or our community center? Where are we already gathering? We'd like to get that information from there. And then thinking about, there was a big desire to learn and be prepared around Cascadia subduction zone earthquakes and then also wildfires. People wanted to know more. Some folks had never even realized that the big earthquake is even a thing. And so I think even bringing up that topic, people wanted to learn more. And then really thinking about participants really trust their organization. So with that trust, how do we continue to give information back to these organizations so that they can continue to offer good information to their communities? And then perceptions of Oregon Health Authority and the government. There's a long conversation around that with many of the groups that we had interviewed. And so information around the perception of the Oregon Health Authority and who they are. And then varying levels of risk perception. I think the interesting piece here was really the groups that had already experienced some level of trauma, if you will. Some of the refugees had already escaped some pretty intense situations. And so that risk of perception of if there's smoke, if there's fire, people really felt like they knew what to do. And so that was an interesting conversation among certain folks who were part of the focus group as well. And then lack of knowledge to make a decision. So for some individuals, there was the piece of, I'm not sure what I don't know. And so again, how do we get the right information to the folks, to the community around natural disasters and what they need to do. So those are some of the themes and how we organize them. So I'm going to jump right into offering some of the recommendations that we offered back to the Oregon Health Authorities team. And these are in no particular order. These are really, again, part of those themes that we had talked about and the reoccurring things that folks had mentioned to our assessment team. So the first being the recommendation around prepared translated information. So again, sharing with our immigrant and refugee population to disseminate information in their language, right? The appropriate language. Second recommendation, develop and provide bilingual, bicultural information and training from respective communities. So not only having a training, but have train the trainer, if you will, have people from the community offer back to their own community information. For some of the communities that we had conducted the focus groups, we had translators, folks who are in not just translating, but part of the community and offering back the information. So really engaging folks in that way. And then the third recommendation here, really talking about creating a more collaborative approach to involve community from the onset. So again, acknowledging that community members listen to one another. So how do we engage those who are seen as leaders within the community to offer back information? So again, whether it's a train the trainer model, how are we involving those folks from the onset and not just coming in as experts, if you will. So kind of being mindful of how community is referred to and how they're characterized as well. So the fourth recommendation that came out from our assessment is really develop simple communications for CBOs to share on their social media platforms. We found that many of the immigrant and refugee populations were using WhatsApp. So as a major form of communication. And so it wasn't necessarily Facebook, it wasn't necessarily Twitter. It was, we would hear things as we sent out a message on WhatsApp and people respond to it really quickly and at a community level. And so really recognizing what are the simple messages that can be offered to communities when it comes to emergency preparedness. And then our fifth recommendation was that OHA HISPR, now HISPR is the Health Systems Preparedness Response Team through the Oregon Health Authority, that unit really connect with the members and provide overall information around Cascadia subduction zone earthquakes, that they reach back out to community and offer information around earthquake and then also wildfire and smoke. And those are simple ways. Oftentimes we would hear community folks says, well, you all get this information from us and we don't ever actually get anything back, right? And so how are we holding government officials accountable for, we give you the information, let's get back the information at a very simple level, just offering again additional information to these communities around those particular topics, I think is another recommendation that came out of this assessment. And then we have our recommendation number 6, which is, when appropriate, include disaster preparedness as part of OHA's branding. So when we had talked to folks, many folks didn't really realize that the Oregon Health Authority had elements of preparedness as a unit within the agency. And I think that they had heard a lot from that Oregon Health Authority during COVID, so they made the connection there, but they didn't realize that the agency also worked in the area of preparedness. And so I think at a very, again, simple level of just making that connection for communities, that OHA or Oregon Health Authority is a trusted resource that can be utilized and should be listened to. And so recommendation 7 that came out of the assessment is, again, involving community-based organizations in the planning and execution of any of the trainings. So many of these folks said, we're so glad that you're asking these questions. We're so glad that, we can even learn a little more. And they were ready to be part of the team that shares back the information with their communities, whether it be their church community or their community-based organization. They really wanted to learn more so that they can offer appropriate information and that connectedness piece. Recommendation number 8 would be to continue to stay active in working directly with community-based organizations. As I mentioned, the Oregon Health Authority has their community engagement team. And so those folks, again, they're doing a great job being a part and reaching out to community, but these community-based organizations say, hey, we also want to be continuing to stay active in connecting with you and getting this information out to our own networks. And what does that look like for the agency? Recommendation number 9 is really to identify the key leaders of community-based organizations and also know what CBOs take that leadership role, right? And so this is really speaking to, we are leaders within our community. How do you want us to disseminate the information? What's the best way? Let us be a part of that conversation. So again, if we have relationship with specific community leaders, it's easy to pick up the phone and say, hey, Christy, this is happening, and then send out that information through those contacts. And so they're saying that's really the relational piece that people wanted to continue. And finally, with our last 2 recommendations, 10 is offering reasonable tips on things to communicate, to be prepared. So again, knowing that to be transparent and let folks know the challenges about predicting outcomes of disasters and emphasize the efficacy of being prepared. So not necessarily, people felt like, we understand that we can't predict when Cascadia will happen, but we want to know what are some really tangible ways that we can be prepared. Communication, knowing, where to go, those type of really tangible ways that communities can come together and stay connected. And then finally, that goes along with recommendation number 11 is the basic preparedness information, providing it in a hands-on, interactive manner, right? For example, folks have brought up the idea of, is there an exercise or is there a workbook that we can all talk it through together as a community, as a group, and then, where would we go? Where would we come together? Where's the evacuation zones for our communities that are so spread out in the Portland metro area? And so what does that mean? Is there a place that we can meet up, right? And so they were talking about a workbook to really guide them through that process and that conversation. So those are the 11 recommendations that were offered up to the Oregon Health Authority from our team. I want to acknowledge the project team who really spent a lot of time connecting with community, even breaking bread with community. We enjoyed a couple really nice meals of rice together. And so again, it's that relational piece that they so often talked about. And so we do want to acknowledge this project team from the Center for Public Service, and then thinking about what our next phases are to doing this work and connecting with not not just saying thank you for the information, but really going back and saying, in addition to the information you provided for us, we want to offer you this. And so that type of work is in the works as a future next step between the Center for Public Service and the Oregon Health Authority. So I want to offer that to you. And then finally, I wanted to offer this last picture. This is an acknowledgement that I know that the wildfires of 2020 really affected our entire state and not just the Portland metro area. This particular picture is of Table Rock in Southern Oregon, where I grew up. And so we know that the devastation in Southern Oregon and across our state was pretty intense in 2020. And, you know, my hope and our team's hope that when we were doing this assessment was really thinking about, you know, that we can ensure that folks in our communities, our Black, Indigenous, our tribal folks, our people of color, that they are going to get the communication that they need during these really critical times for their health and their family's health. So with that, I say thank you.
Thank you so much, New. It's great to have you. So for our next speaker, I am so excited for everyone to meet Nika Tahan, pronouns she, her. Nika is an emergency preparedness researcher and consultant. They have 5 years having worked with California's Office of the Governor as the senior manager of the Listos California Emergency Preparedness Campaign, which was housed out of the Office of Emergency Services. Nika worked across sectors to develop, deliver, and evaluate culturally and linguistically relevant COVID-19 emergency preparedness materials, reaching over 20 million Californians' most underrepresented communities. During Blue Skies, she was charged with developing cross-sector relationships in order to strengthen the state's commitment to service and volunteerism. In Gray Skies, Nika was deployed to the State Operations Center and Joint Information Center to support management of donations and volunteers, including CERT, C-E-R-T, and AmeriCorps disaster members. Welcome, Nika, and feel free to go ahead and pull up your amazing presentation. It's good to have you.
Great, thank you all so much, and thank you for that long, very detailed introduction. And I'm really excited to be here today. Sorry, everybody. We practice this and everything, and it's still being funky. There we go. Okay. Just kidding. Wow. Sorry, y'all.
Doing great.
So thank you so much again, Christy. And thank you to all of you who are here today, as well as the other presenters and researchers. Just very excited to be here and really honored to be here amongst all of you. This presentation is going to be going over a report that I wrote alongside some other really wonderful people and through the United Way, including Christy, who is our wonderful host today. So shout out to Christy. Our report is called Preparing Oregon's Communities of Color for Disasters, Where We Are and Where We Need to Go. So just first to explain why this report is important, or why we feel like it's important, is first of all, the vision. So, you know, really wanting to see a more prepared Oregon across the board, demystifying gaps and urgent needs. So, you know, I think those of us who have worked in this field, especially in trying to get systems that are already existing and have existed for a really long time to listen to the needs and to really explain that there are needs. Oftentimes what we hear back is, where's the data? Where's the proof? How do we know that this is true? Even though we know it's true from our own experiences, from living through disaster, from trying to do this work, we know it's true. We've just heard that over and over again. So really hoping that this report can kind of demystify some of that for folks that it still might be mystifying too. And then leaning into research, especially research that comes from an empowered perspective, a value-based perspective, and a participatory kind of methodology. So first I just want to explain some kind of vernacular or vocabulary that I might be using in defining what we mean by inclusive messaging. So in the context of this report, that really meant linguistically and culturally accessible, easy for community members to find, understand, and use, culturally appropriate images, language, and references that are woven throughout materials and messaging. And then also, resources that are co-created with community members, by community members, and for community members. I won't go over this whole list. I know everybody will be able to see this presentation later, but just wanted to share and shout out some of our primary public sector partners, as well as funding partners on this list, including Oregon Health Authority, the Office of Emergency Management, as well as the Oregon Disaster Funders Network and their members. Some of the other project partners that we also really wanted to highlight today is Nextdoor, Unete, and Unite Oregon. These were our three primary CBO partners. They really helped us and worked with us and participated in looking over survey questions, kind of guiding us to the right people to interview and participate in focus groups, and we're really just a huge pillar of this project. So in terms of methodology, kind of the primary things I wanted to highlight today was participant sampling. So we definitely looked to have the most cross-sector kind of participation as possible. So that included community-based organizations. Under that umbrella, I would also like to add community members and community leaders. Public sector representatives. Again, that includes an array of folks from the national level at FEMA to local emergency managers, to sheriff's offices, to different members of the emergency management system, as well as philanthropic partners. From that, we were able to get 120 participants. 94 individuals participated in 13 focus groups, and 26 individuals participated in one-on-one interviews. So one of the first findings that we were able to gather from that and from talking to all of those really wonderful people, and if any of you on this call happen to be one of those 120 people, thank you so much for participating and for giving your time, space, labor, understanding to us. But one of the first things that we really found is that momentum is in fact building. So to kind of start on a more positive note, there is a lot of things that are in the works. I mean, just even this panel of individuals and all of the research that we were doing pretty simultaneously, and the projects that we were doing pretty simultaneously shows that there is a lot that is starting to happen. The three kind of sub points that we found from that is there's collaboration that's going on across the state. capacity building to some extent, although there's definitely, still work to be done, and structure. There are some structural changes. For instance, Oregon's emergency management structure from the state level is shifting, and that's means that it's a really advantageous time to try and also advocate for some other major changes. So although there's a lot of positive things happening, I think a lot of us are here because we know that there's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of barriers to overcome still. I won't be going over every single one of these points, but I would like to highlight some of the barriers to inclusivity that we found. The first one and the most major one was a lack of statewide convener. Another that I would like to highlight is low technology access and literacy. So a lot of the way that we do preparedness work, messaging, alerts is through technology. And that can be really challenging when we have low access and literacy in a lot of the communities that we're trying to reach. Restricted funding, widespread distrust, and kind of special focuses that can really leave out large groups of individuals. So for instance, there's a lot of focus on translating of materials, but that only really is providing one type of access to very specific communities and leaves out a whole lot of other folks that language or translation might not be kind of the barrier to preparedness. Just to dive a little bit deeper, into one of these barriers, the lack of statewide convener. And again, this is something that, over 90% of folks that we talk to, and then you can see here 98% of interviewees, focus group surveys identified, found this to be a barrier. And what this means is really, again, there is some momentum building, there are frustrations, there are some real challenges. It's quite difficult to figure out at a statewide level, who is the person or who are the people that are really owning this? Where do we go to change some of these systems, to implement some of these programs, and to align the work, right? As this is becoming more of an issue, there's also duplication of work. And so who's kind of holding all of that and who is organizing all of this? I just want to give some time for our translator to be able to catch up. I know I talk quickly. So with that, I would like to share a quote from one of our community member participants. The toughest thing right now is that we don't have someone looking at the whole state's approach. We don't have someone tracking all the work being done and making sure we aren't repeating efforts across Oregon. Without that kind of central convener, we can't be super strategic in working with other organizations and local governments. And another quote, there is no standard or common goal across the entire state of Oregon when it comes to BIPOC targeted disaster preparedness. Because of this, our communities are really hurting. So moving into a recommendation. So if you're able to read our report or get our report, you will find that we have a list, quite a long substantial list of recommendations as well. I really encourage folks to read through that and to get a better sense. But to highlight one of the recommendations that we found is really working together differently. So what this means in this context is situate inclusive disaster preparedness messaging and materials in comprehensive, equitable initiatives that meet community identified needs. What that means kind of in an actionable sense is identifying a primary statewide convener, supporting community-based organizations, and expanding cross-sector partnerships. The next recommendation that I wanted to highlight today was, or is, embracing meaningful community engagement. So again, I think what we found was there's lots of really wonderful initiatives happening, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done when it actually comes to engaging community. And I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here on this call. I think most of us already know this, but just want to highlight it in this context. So what that really means here is, listen to and learning from communities, ensuring that processes are open and accessible, and are centering the needs of the people that are most impacted by disasters. What it will take to kind of get there is building trust. As we know, there's a lot of lack of trust. One thing that I would just highlight that is pretty unique to Oregon, even compared to other states, is, for instance, a lot of emergency managers are housed out of sheriff's offices. That's really different than a lot of other places. And I don't think I'm saying anything controversial by saying that a lot of a lot of individuals from communities of color don't have a lot of trust when it comes to law enforcement. So right there, that's a challenge. So how do we, if that's the system that exists in Oregon, how do we start building trust? Identifying and engaging kind of champions. So community champions, cultural champions, folks that really represent the groups of individuals that we're trying to engage. And finally, hiring representative staff. One of the things we heard consistently was how much of an impact it really makes on individuals when they see people that represent themselves in positions of power, in CBOs, at the state level, within emergency management settings. So again, it's beyond having a translated material, but actually knowing I can go to somebody who looks like me, feels like me, really understands me and my people and my community. Finally, I just want to highlight kind of a special focus, which again, kind of summarizes what I've been talking about a little bit, but outreach does not equal representation. So again, just kind of handing out a pamphlet or doing some light touch and interaction with communities is not the same as representing communities in disaster preparedness and alert systems. So what we hope to see more or encourage more of is integrating community members into decision-making processes at every step of the way, engaging community leaders and again, public sector champions, and hiring and retaining representative staff. We also have a recommendation that's investing in innovation. So again, moving beyond translation and developing new funding streams. And this is a quote that kind of hopefully summarizes that well. The disaster world is really traditional and people are set in their ways. I hope that with this change referring to the Office of Emergency Management, there will also be room to make other changes and to bring new initiatives to the table. I think the time to act on targeted BIPOC preparedness is now. when people are already getting used to new things. We need to use this moment to progress this kind of preparedness forward. So what's next? We need to take action. So hopefully by reading and sharing the report, investing in collaborative, properly representative initiatives, doing more research, doing more events like this, engaging researchers with each other, and staying connected. There's a lot of people we would like to acknowledge. Again, all of this is in the report and will be shared with you to read afterwards. I don't want to take more people's time. And I just want to say thank you for letting me speak today. And hopefully, even if you didn't learn anything new, this felt like it was at least representative of some of your experience and validating to some of the experiences that I think, again, many of us on this call have had and continue, unfortunately, to have.
Thank you so much, Nika. It's great to have you. Looks like we're generating some good questions that are coming through. Next up, I would love to introduce someone who is so wildly talented and just a great role model for me and so many other people doing this work. Julie Early Cifuentes, pronouns she, ella, is one of Oregon Health Authority's climate and health leads. She is a mama, a mother and daughter with deep family roots in Oregon and in the Peruvian Andes. As a collaborative storyteller and researcher, Julie is passionate about bringing the lived experience of people most affected by an issue to decision makers. Julie led OHA's recent study on climate change and youth mental health. It was designed to center the lived experiences of youth from communities most affected by climate change. It includes focus groups with youth from the Klamath tribes and youth from Southern Oregon communities that were devastated by the 2020 wildfires. Thank you, Julie, for coming to this offering today. You can go ahead and kick it off from here.
Thank you so much, Christy. Thanks everyone for being here. It is truly an honor to be included in this panel. Today, I'm going to talk with you, as Christy mentioned, about a study that OHA did recently that's focused on the impacts of climate change on youth mental health. I want to use as much time as possible to really highlight what we heard from youth and people working with youth, which means that I am going to be sort of spending less time on like background and methodology and kind of breeze through some of that. But if you're interested, a link to that report will be shared in the chat. And that has kind of more of that, the background and frameworks, et cetera. But also there are a lot of quotes from youth and spotlights on some projects that are supporting the well-being of youth in the face of climate change. So here I'm going to, this is all looking okay to folks? My screen was looking a little bit weird.
Yes.
Okay, great. So do want to acknowledge some of our project partners. This was a highly collaborative effort, and many organizations supported us in this project. Kind of similar to the prior project, we chose a participatory sort of style model. We drew from Youth Participatory Action Research Framework, also called YPAR. And that was sort of a values-based decision on really honoring the agency and expertise of those who are living closest to a challenge. On this slide, I want to highlight here the participatory circle. So we engaged with and compensated youth to be our advisors and provide feedback at different points of the process throughout the study. Advisors facilitated a virtual gathering that was open to all youth where we presented some of our preliminary findings and were able to get some input. And we also worked with our youth advisors and actually sort of cultivated a group of youth storytellers who were really excited to be able to share their stories and perspectives when we released the report in June. So just to kind of further amplify their voices and the findings from the report throughout the state. So our approach to this study was qualitative, and we did throughout the process really sought to center the voices of youth, especially tribal youth and youth of color. So whether from recruitment to the to the writing of the report. We had just talk through a little bit sort of kind of the sources of data that we used for this study. We conducted 5 focus groups across the state, and I think Christy mentioned some of these. We spoke with youth from the Klamath tribes, youth with disabilities in Central Oregon, youth who were engaged in climate activism in Southern Oregon and in the Portland area, youth engaged in mental health advocacy in the Eugene and Salem area. So the focus groups were definitely a centerpiece of the study. We also conducted interviews with mental health, education, public health sectors. We also included in this study youth story circles in the Phoenix Talent School District. And some of you might know that this was a school district that was in the most impacted part of the state during the September 2020 wildfires, where 1/3 of the students were part of households that were displaced by the fires. And then finally, the literature review. And climate change and mental health is very much an emerging area of research. There are many publications that even just came out during the course of the study. And one really large study about youth mental health and climate change. I want to highlight the youth, let me go back to the youth storytellers. This is a part of we actually hadn't planned it ahead of time, but as we went through the process, we found more and more youth who were interested in sharing their stories more broadly. So we, and this was really definitely the most impactful thing for me in terms of just listening to youth and better understanding their perspective. And so here we have a sort of a screenshot of the OHA press conference for the report. And, here starred the 3 youth who joined us in sharing their remarks in this press conference. And for this presentation, I wanted to note I'm including quotes from the report, as well as quotes from stories that youth shared directly with the media. And I asked youth who were involved with the project, along with my colleagues, to create recordings of these quotes just to bring them a little bit more to life during the presentation. So what did we learn? Well, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the research, highly in terms of the existing literature on climate change and mental health, just encourage you to take a look at the report. We've briefly summarized the existing research, but at a high level, what we read in the research is that climate change is affecting mental health through 3 main pathways. So climate-related disasters, environmental degradation, or what's also called chronic climate stressors, as well as climate anxiety. So I'm going to talk a very high level, but on some of these, but really focus on some of the quotes that we heard, what we heard from youth. So disasters, I think it's not hard to imagine how disasters that can displace families, the social networks, sometimes devastate entire communities and take lives. It's not hard to imagine how disasters might affect the mental health of the entire community. And so I'm just going to play a few quotes here.
After the fires, I remember realizing that most of the places I grew up going to had burnt in the fires. Finding out most of those places had burnt down was really hard to deal with. Those are really important spots to me. I wanted to share those with people I know and my own family when I get older.
It's always been smoky here in the summers. The smell of it is really scary now. The night before the fire, the wind was howling. The wind always startles me now.
Going through those climate disasters, it definitely takes a toll on someone. After taking a walk on that day, I remember crying in my kitchen because I knew we were going to have to go through that again, and other people are going to have to go through that again. Right now, it doesn't feel like it is going to be okay.
So another pathway through which climate change can affect our mental health is through kind of, I guess, another way to put this is like slow-moving disasters. And so what falls in this category might be sort of this like overarching decrease in air quality, drought, which then can affect food insecurity, water insecurity. And for communities who live really closely to and depend on their natural environments, it can affect their livelihood. And for many Indigenous communities whose cultural practices are very closely tied to the land, this is another way that their mental health can be impacted. And that was primarily where we heard this pathway was from our Indigenous youth participants.
In my mother's generation, when she was growing up, she would go to traditional ceremonies and have smoked salmon that was fished traditionally by our people on our river, which we have fished at since time immemorial. In my lifetime, eating that fish, seeing that smoked salmon in our ceremonies is scarce. This is full spiritual, emotional, and physical embodiment of how I am stressed out by this and how this impacts me.
The number one thing that we try to protect is our hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. You can't fish the fish that we used to, or we can't gather the things that we used to, because they no longer grow here. That affects our livelihood. Or even if it's not our livelihood anymore, our connection to our ancestors, our connection to our culture, our traditions. I think that's one of the things that could be affecting our mental health and our physical health.
So this other pathway, you might have heard, I feel like there's been more coverage and talk about climate anxiety or eco-anxiety. And this is really just the range of feelings, from fear to grief to hopelessness, that a lot of us are feeling as we both sort of maybe experience or observe or hear about in the news how climate change is affecting people and the injustices around that. And so this area, this is, like I mentioned, is a very kind of emerging area of research. And when we started the study, we didn't see anything in the literature that was focused on youth specifically. And so we felt this was a good opportunity to explore what climate anxiety feels like for youth in particular. And so, like I mentioned, it's a range of feelings: fear, anger, grief, powerlessness, frustration and anger that not more is being done. And then there are some things I think were very unique that we heard from youth that you might not hear from people from older generations. That feeling dismissed by adults and feeling really alone contributes and sort of exacerbates that the anxiety around climate change. But also a sense of unjust burden and responsibility, and that feeling that both combined with maybe as a young person feeling like you have less ability to influence, and yet people who might be in a better place to do that seem to be sort of shifting that burden and responsibility to you and your generation, maybe just by not doing enough. And then finally, also just the climate impacts on top of structural and historical violence is another element of climate anxiety for youth. a couple more quotes here.
It's like a constant thing, and it's like it affects all things and includes the wildfires on top of the settlers, on top of their violence. And then thinking more broadly and globally, because I'm also indigenous to the islands of Tonga, a lot of our people are climate refugees and are no longer able to return home to the islands because it's sinking and cemeteries are underwater. And that's also settler-induced climate change. I feel like climate change cannot be talked about without talking about settler colonialism, white supremacy, and like genocide.
My friend started talking like, why even have kids? Why plan our future that far ahead? We could be bringing someone into a world where they might not have that long to live or be able to breathe clean air, swim in clean water.
I remember growing up hearing, you can fix the world, and your generation is going to be the one to fix it. And somehow they saw it as empowering. Like, you guys, you got this, you can do this. But like, I just grew up with that pressure. And yeah, we have to do it, but it's not really a decision that we got to make.
They've already lived their futures, if that makes sense. But I still don't know what mine's going to look like because of this existential threat. And so it's like yelling at a wall about this really scary thing, but not really hearing anything back.
I just invite you just to maybe take a moment as I'm sort of listening. That kind of heaviness is really kind of hitting me, and kind of know I'm kind of going through these a little bit quickly, maybe more quickly than one can absorb. So just want to give everyone a few seconds before shifting gears. So in this study, we also asked about what builds resilience and hope in the face of climate change. And here are some of the themes that that we heard. We heard from youth about the importance of building community, about organizing, coming together with other youth and other people to really focus on making change and solutions. And also, especially for our youth from communities that have been marginalized, how important cultural identity and expression is in terms of resilience. And I wanted to highlight, I just have stars here, and a couple of these that I think are a little unique to climate change. And that is this sort of spaces to share climate distress and hopes. And this was something that we heard from youth. It came out in that multiple people remarked when they were asked what builds resilience, what gives you hope, multiple people said, like this space right here, this focus group where we actually have a chance to share how we're feeling and not feel so alone in those feelings, but also be able to share, things that give them hope and the ways they're working towards change. And then strengthening our relationship with nature and with the land. And that's, I'm just highlighting that because I think that often isn't something that we talk about in the context of our mental and emotional well-being. We definitely heard this really clearly from our Native participants in the study. We also see this a lot in research, the importance of our connection with nature in terms of our overall well-being. So in terms of like what's next, again, really want to point you back to the report. There's a lot of different sort of different ideas. There's sort of different things that I think, depending on what sector you work in or what kind of organization or how you engage with youth, it might look a little bit differently, but some overarching themes. One includes youth-adult partnerships. So I think this moves away from like, just think, okay, we want to engage youth, empower youth. Yes, that's important. And also, we heard from youth that they don't want to be alone in this and they want to see adults taking more leadership. And so just kind of considering how we might think about youth-adult partnerships in addition to, youth engagement or as a way to engage with youth. Healing-centered engagement is an approach and framework that was developed by Sean Ginwright, and it grew out of efforts to really engage with youth of color around social change and also around their own well-being, and has a focus on cultivating connection, culture, and hope as we work towards social change. I think that's particularly important when we're working, if we're dealing with both, climate change intersecting with other social injustices. And then finally, just that cross-sectoral collaboration and integration. And I think the newer thing here is really thinking about mental health and environmental health. And let's consider how those are connected and how we might need to be collaborating and connecting more around those. And then finally, I just thought this was a really very wise quote from a 16-year-old student who was in our press conference. I believe she made this statement, and when the media asked her, what can we do? What should we be doing next? And I'll just read this. A good starting point for the adults around me, the parents around me, the teachers around me, the educators around me, is to have intergenerational conversations about the climate crisis. And so there's this little acknowledgement for our voice actors. And just want to say, that those intergenerational conversations, right, is a first step. I think, clearly, swift and bold action to tackle the climate crisis is fundamental. And I think what this study, helps us to consider is like, how do we do that? We want to do that in partnering with youth, understanding where youth are coming from, and in a way that really that centers healing. So thank you so much.
Julie, that was Julie, everyone. Thank you for this amazing information. And I think it's very clear as we go through these reports and as we're, gathered here today. We had over 200 people registered from our state alone, that the crisis is not just the disaster, right? The crisis is also the process as to how we collaborate and communicate, build trust and relationship with each other. So that's just one thing for us to consider. And then that lens that we just heard Julie bring in around mental and emotional well-being in the context of disaster is so important. So speaking of disrupting, just serving and barreling through more presentations, we're gonna give all attendees and presenters, say like a 3-minute bio break to grab more water, go take care of your human needs. If you're here still and you want just a second, also to come with me on a quick 2-minute breath, even less, feel free to stay with me for the next 2 minutes. So for those of you stepping out and wanting to hear Ahmed's amazing toolkit, please stay with us. We will be here until 2:30. For us coming back, go ahead and come back at 8, 9, 10, 2:10. That sounds good to me, 2:10. So for those who decided to stay for the breath, we talk about climate resilience. We also, after processing a lot of stories, research, content, we can take in a moment to ground ourselves out of the mind and back into body. So go ahead and you can look away from the screen or have your eyes closed or have gentle eyes, also known as kitten eyes, not looking at anything in particular. Your feet can be grounded towards the earth. Take a nice deep breath through the nose and exhale out the mouth. If it helps to have a hand on the belly and a hand on the chest. It's a lot that we processed and heard and are digesting. So once again, take a deep breath through the nose. and out the mouth. If you'd like to do that for the next few minutes as we wait for folks to come back, go ahead. I'll go ahead and take also a break with our translators. See you back in 1 minute. All right, welcome back, presenters and attendees. It's my pleasure to introduce our last speaker for the day, someone who is very apt at bringing people together, condensing stories, perspectives, and giving us some actionable things to use as a community, not just for our state and our region locally, but also nationally. Ahmed Gaya, pronouns he, they, is the Senior Strategist for Climate and Mitigation National Partnership for New Americans, also abbreviated as NPNA. Ahmed is the child of a Pakistani immigrant, and the impacts of climate change on his family's country of origin have motivated him to engage in climate justice work for over a decade in the Pacific Northwest. At the beginning of 2021, he helped launch the Climate Justice Collaborative to help immigrant and refugees organizations engage with the unique impacts of climate change faced by their members. Ahmed spent the last 2 years incubating the collaborative in a movement-wide process involving dozens of immigrant rights and climate justice organizations. This toolkit, Relief and Recovery on the Front Lines of Disaster, summarizes the learnings and experiences of over a dozen NPNA partners as they respond to extreme weather events. Ahmed, thank you for having us. Can kick it off.
Totally, and thank you so much for that introduction, Christy. For those who don't know, the National Partnership for New Americans is a coalition of 61 immigrant rights organizations at the state, local, and regional level across the United States in 40 states. And the Climate Justice Collaborative, specifically, as Christy mentioned, is a project that we launched at the beginning of this year, coming out of kind of a multi-year series of conversations in the immigrant rights movement and how to engage with the unique impacts of climate on our communities. And it's just sort of a really privilege to kind of join that process, join and kind of launch this new initiative. And this report, which is really more of a toolkit, it's a little bit of a different thing than some of the other things that have been presented today. Because the focus is less on original research and more on capturing the learnings and tips from our members as they've responded to extreme weather and sharing those out into the world in a way that is hopefully actionable for other CBOs, government agencies, etc. So, the toolkit, just to tell a little bit about where it came from, and we released this just a couple of months ago. As Christy mentioned, for the last few years before we launched the Climate Justice Collaborative within NPNA, we've been facilitating a series of conversations. And one of the things that we wanted to map were how are immigrant rights organizations right now experiencing and engaging with the climate crisis. And they were doing so in a variety of ways. Obviously, climate as a driver of migration, climate and climate action as a workforce development opportunity, and the kind of discrepancy in the green economy and how to get our members and community members into those jobs. But the number one way in which immigrant rights organizations were finding as their entry point into climate work was simply the impact of extreme weather and climate disasters on their members. And one thing we heard from immigrant rights organizations is that they were seeing these disasters now as cyclical and seasonal events rather than rapid response, kind of one-time things they would respond to once a decade or once every 5 years. And they felt very isolated in their response. They were not designed, their organizations were not designed to engage in disaster response work, to support, they were supporting government agencies in other ways, but this was a whole new area of work where they did not have capacity. So one of the first things our members asked us to do was support them in kind of capturing some of the learnings and producing a set of resources around that. And this is actually the first in a set of resources that we hope to produce. So just for context on the report and kind of where it came from, it came out of a series of deep interviews, conversations, and surveys with 14 organizations, the bulk of which are listed up on the screen, the bulk of which are members of NPNA, though there are a number of those organizations which are partners of ours or organizations that are kind of like affiliated with our individual members in a state. For example, the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, our member, One America in Washington helped incubate that, but it is a separate organization in the state of Washington. In Oregon specifically, we did have 3 groups participate pretty actively in producing the toolkit and have some of their learnings and stories shared. Those would be Bakun, the farm worker union based out of Woodburn, who is an affiliate of NPNA, and then 2 NPNA members, Unite Oregon was mentioned in some previous research, as well as APANO, the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, participated in this research and then are also kind of more broadly engaged in the work of the Climate Justice Collaborative. So when putting this together and in our conversations, our members really, as I said, see these extreme weather events as cyclical and as part of a cycle that we tried to capture. There's a rapid response phase immediately after the disasters. There's a period of long-term recovery and rebuilding. There's community preparedness and building resilience. And I think one of the great things about this webinar is that the research that we've heard today has touched on in different ways, kind of, I think, all 3 elements of this cycle of disaster that we're now experiencing. Our toolkit, while it does touch on all 3, is mainly focused on the rapid response side of it, kind of how organizations can immediately respond after disasters happen and help shape government response in their local areas. We are hoping to produce and planning to produce a set of resources in the other 2 areas as well around long-term recovery and rebuilding and community preparedness and building resilience. But as I said, this toolkit is more focused on that rapid response phase with more allusions to these other 2 areas. And I'm not gonna, because the toolkit is so broad and covers a really wide range of experiences, I'm gonna elevate a few learnings from it, but I think in 10 minutes, I don't have the time to kind of go in detail through everything in it. My hope is to kind of lay out the structure, what kind of content is in there, surface a few of the learnings and stories that we captured in the toolkit. And obviously it's out there in the world. We encourage you to read it, to use it, to reach out to the organizations that participated in its creation. If you have more questions for them, to reach out to us if we can be a support to you. But in that kind of rapid response learnings, we kind of broke things down into 5 core areas. The first, and kind of I think the one that regardless of the level of engagement organizations we interviewed were doing in disaster response, all of them were doing some amount of, which was sharing emergency information and sharing compiled lists of resources with their communities. I heard a number of stories of ways in which this was done well, a number of stories of challenges folks had with this. And those are listed in the toolkit. I think some of the big kind of come away lessons from this we have that I'd kind of give context to all 5 of these areas were that the vetting, the deeper that an organization can go in terms of vetting the resources, the level of service that's being provided, and following up with their members as they go through that process, the better the outcome that we can create. We've had a lot of organizations which were going one step beyond kind of sharing the basic information, doing basic levels of language access, sharing resources, found that many of the members that they referred to resources actually were facing structural or systemic barriers, or the service providers outside of government service providers were not qualified or prepared to handle and support their members who had different cultural needs, language needs, etc. And that opened up a whole other body of work for them. Assessing community impact was another area that our members really assessed a big need for community-based organizations, especially as was mentioned in one of the previous presentations of the natural distrust in immigrant communities for law enforcement, militarized response, etc., and the really heavily militarized nature of much of the response to natural disasters. So the impact on our communities, we found in a lot of the experience of our members, was vastly underreported and unknown by government agencies providing services. And so that was another kind of core area that we've tried to provide some tips. Thirdly, accessing services and resources. Fourthly, staying organized, just some basic resources for organizations into how best to, what we've learned, kind of best practices in organizing their systems, as oftentimes, like I said, immigrant rights organizations are not prepared to kind of retool their entire operation for disaster response. There's other work that needs to continue. So how best to kind of both spin up a program relatively quickly, but also continue doing your core work and move people on a services to organizing pipeline, which is the last section of the toolkit around building power for the long term, which we really see a critical role for organizations that are doing advocacy, organizations that are, both kind of trying to do immediate service provision in the moment, but have a longer term agenda around creating more equitable structures and equitable systems within our state, fighting for things like immigration reform, etc. That kind of using these moments and using the services we provide, it's important to step in and also to organize folks and move them on a pipeline from both receiving services into organizing. And then I've just put up here as an example of just kind of some of the level of detail within the toolkit, some of like this one page we did on like creating a hotline, what are some of the tips that folks can use in building up. Many immigrant rights organizations already have hotlines dedicated towards ICE raids or towards other emergencies in the community, how to repurpose those specifically in a disaster scenario. We tried to sprinkle stories from the field would have as much learnings as possible throughout the toolkit. So a few that I just wanted to highlight up on the screen, obviously are one from Oregon, the experience that Unite Oregon had with different methods for providing direct cash assistance to members. And tried to get in that level of detail in the toolkit. The challenges folks had using gift cards for cash assistance, for example, the different payment services folks used, are recognizing that those payment services are often culturally relevant. Like some communities are more utilize Cash App more than Venmo. Some of these things aren't like we pulled out things to think about rather than overall learnings, because the specific applicable recommendation was different from community to community around the country, from ethnic community, from language need, etc. There are some spaces where folks were like, oh, we found that we had to do all of our cash payments through Cash App because that was like the only thing that our members were on. other spaces where that recommendation was not relevant. So I would say we tried to highlight stories of experience, but are really one of the overarching things to think about when using the toolkit is just how is that relevant to your community, your experience, because it does, the data does come from kind of a wide survey of folks around the country. While most of it is focused on our rapid response learnings and that work, we do try and lay out and preview some of the areas that we see for policy work around equitable recovery and resilience. I know that we're running a little bit short on time, so I won't read them all here, but they're up on the screen. The ones that are just going to highlight that folks have been experimenting with right now that we're really excited about are specific recovery funds for immigrant and undocumented communities, work around resisting disaster gentrification and housing work that's happening in this disaster moments, and this concept of building out resilience hubs in community infrastructure that already exists, like ethnic community centers. So just moving from there into some of the next steps that we see. So that this toolkit is sort of, like I said, the first resource in a set of resources that we're hoping to produce. Next up, obviously, we have a member that was involved in this toolkit that we're working with very closely in the Climate Justice Collaborative down in Florida. And so we are producing some resources that are mapping federal disaster funds so organizations can have the information they need to advocate for those to be spent equitably and used effectively for our communities. We're using it in the context of Hurricane Ian in Florida. We're also developing a set of resources that are more member focused to support immigrant communities accessing relief benefits, clearing up some of the most common misrepresentations that we heard and challenges folks have accessing federal benefits they may be eligible for. And then a set of white papers specifically on state policies based on the things that I just had up on the last slide, like disaster gentrification, resilience hubs, and community recovery funds for undocumented folks. And then at the national level and the state level, the Climate Justice Collaborative NPNA is also engaged in supporting our members in federal and state advocacy around all of these areas. So I know that I'm pushing up against my time right there. So I will wrap it up there, and I think a few moments for questions, if I'm correct.
Thank you, Ahmed. That was really helpful. Let our folks get some water. Elizabeth, sticking with us this whole time. So we are coming up a little bit close to time, and what we might do, we see quite a few questions that we've received in the chat, and we don't want to have everyone feel compressed and stressed to try to get them all answered right now. The good news is we are going to be returning back to our presenters, capturing all those questions and notes, and then asking if they want to answer those questions and emailing everybody who registered back those answers. The other thing is we've been sharing in the chat bar the contact information and name and report link of today's presenters. And as a friendly reminder, everything will have been recorded and will be shared in English, Spanish, and ASL interpretation. So, if for some reason you have someone that you'd like to share this with, please go ahead and amplify and send it off. We'll be sure to send that out before the end of this week. I did want to mention, if you are a researcher, if you are someone working in any sector, whether it's the public sector, maybe you work for a 501c(b)(o), maybe you work, within the context of community under higher education, such as PSU, and you'd like to share with our United Way and other researchers here reports that have come out in the last 2 years or that you're working on in the next 2 years around disaster and climate resilience and its impacts on communities of color, especially frontline communities of color, please let us know. You can email us at unitedway-pdx.org under the contacts list. Through our partnerships and with other United Ways, we will make sure to be sharing all of those research pieces with colleagues here in Oregon. And as you can see, this webinar was intended to amplify research and the work that researchers have put across all sectors in helping us better our services and better our communities around achieving climate resilience. And that means something different for every region and every person. And we're acknowledging that that is going to be a long road ahead, but we're here doing it together. Lastly, thank you and gratitude to all of the researchers, Nu, Julie, Nika, Ahmed. Thank you so much for joining us for this hour-and-a-half celebration in some ways around research and the work that you've been doing. We will make sure that everyone receives your contact information if they want to utilize this research to amplify either programs that are happening at their CBO or perhaps in partnerships that they might want to lean into your research and your work. And then lastly, gratitude to community members who in the last few years have been stepping up to support community in wildfires and any kind of all hazards disasters. Even if you don't have expertise within it, you are standing up for your communities and making sure that their needs are met and that their voices are heard. So thank you to the youth that are doing all the translations in disaster management, to community leaders who are stepping up in spaces, whether invited or not invited, and of course, to those that are being activated in so many ways to find solutions. We do see you, and we really hope that we can collectively support each other in these ways. And last but not least, gratitude to our ancestors for witnessing us try to move this work forward, and for us in this room as ancestors as well. So as we work together, I really hope that we can end today, not just in a note of learning, but in a note of looking forward towards what we can build together. On behalf of United Way of the Columbia, thank you so much for coming out today and looking forward to connecting with you all in whatever way is appropriate for you. Take care.